So my name is Russell, and I know you. I know you from Eastern. Right?
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Oh no, I thought you were talking to me.
No, and I know you from last year. Yeah.
The year before.
The year before. Okay. Okay. So, I'm actually a clinical psychologist, and although I've done a lot of Buddhist practice, and I teach a lot about compassion, I don't really fashion myself a Buddhist teacher. So you're going to get. So I think you're going to hear some things from me that are will reinforce and will be very consistent with what you've heard from other teachers here. And you'll probably hear some things that are a little different too, because I come at things from a little different perspective. Right? So I think and talk and write a lot about compassion. So that'll be kind of the focus of what we'll be thinking about today. But in the service of that, actually, I'm going to mess with you a little bit because you're all like oriented on your cushions and you're all looking forward at me, and that's really great. But I'd like to start by having you like look around the room at one another. And as you look around at one another and meet each other's gaze, try to really see one another. And when I say really see one another, I mean, it's okay. You can smile and wave, and yeah, you can greet one another. As you look around at one another, do so with the awareness that every person whose gaze you meet, everyone you see, has a story that runs every bit as deep as yours does. Everyone you see has a life full of hopes and dreams and triumph and sorrow and aspirations and disappointment. I think this kind of simple awareness can be really powerful, to like take as many moments as we can throughout the day to really see one another and recognize that, actually that although it may feel like I'm the star of my own private movie, and that all of this exists just for me, and that all the people I interact with are like play different roles in my story. The recognition that it's like that for everybody because of how our perception works. Does that make sense? It's kind of a trick. And it's not a trick like that was played on us. It's a trick of just how our perception works. We have sort of unlimited access to our own internal experience. So if we're feeling something or thinking something or poring over something or playing out mental imagery, we have this like rich experience of our own lives. And that can be very tricky too, because it means if we're feeling an emotion we'd rather not be feeling, or something's happened that we don't like, or we've behaved in a way that doesn't fit with the sort of person we want to be, we can almost literally swim in that all day, or I guess figuratively swim in it all day. We can think about it and stew over it and play it over in our minds and do that. Does that make sense? And at the same time, when we look out at the world and at other people, we really have almost no access to the internal worlds of other people. We have almost no way of really knowing what they think or how they feel or what their experience of life is, except insofar as we are willing to listen to them and to learn about their experience, and to kind of set aside our commitment to our own story and our own internal dialogue or whatever's going on, and just pause that and just really listen with this like earnest desire to really get the internal world of the other person. And even if we're doing all of that, we're only privy to it to the extent that they share it with us. And to the extent we can maybe infer something about what they might be experiencing based on our own experience. Right? Imagining, gosh, if I were in that situation, how might I feel? But even that is very tricky. Even that's kind of a trap, because my history as a straight white guy from rural Oklahoma is entirely different from the histories of many, many people that I will encounter. And so if I try to impose my understanding of the way life is on, what's your name, Miss?
Bella.
On Bella, I'm likely to be way, way off the mark. Because Bella's a woman. And I don't know what it's like to be a woman, except insofar as I listen to the voices of women who are willing to sort of courageously share that experience with me. You know, I've actually funnily found that out the hard way when I went through when my wife was pregnant with our son Dylan, and I was, you know, I wanted to be a good husband through the process because, you know, she was doing all the work, you know, and so I went to all the appointments, and I went to, you know, I just was a part of the whole process. And I have to tell you, I go to these OBGYN appointments like, you have to do this? And she's like laughing, but she's like, yeah, since I was 12, you know, since I was 10, this is the way life is if you're a woman in modern culture. And I have to tell you, ladies, guys have a very different experience of adolescence. We just don't do that at all, you know, because we don't have to. And, you know, it was like, wow. That's a very kind of different way of being in the world. And that's just one dimension of diversity. That's just one sort of dimension of difference. And if then you then multiply that times what it's like to grow up in a different culture, or what it's like to be gay, or what it's like to be a different race, or a different, you know, all that stuff, you know. So it's very dangerous for us to apply our template of experience and assume that that's valid for somebody else. And I think that's a really dangerous thing to do, actually. It's very easy to slip from, this is the way it is for me, or this is the way it has been for me. It's very easy to slip from that into this is the way it is, with a capital I. And then we start imposing our experience on other people. And I think there's a lot of cruelty and, you know, not good things that come out of that. So, to come back to that initial practice, I think the extent to which we can really see other people as multidimensional beings who have this whole wealth of experience, both in terms of life experience and internal experience, it's just as deep as ours. That they feel just as deeply as ours. They just as much as we want to be happy, just as much as we want to be cared about, just as much as we want to have lives that are meaningful and fulfilling. Everyone we see has that same stuff too. And it's easy to forget that when we get kind of caught up in our own, whatever it is we're dealing with in our lives, whether it's a goal we're pursuing, or whether it's something that we feel threatened by. So what I thought I would talk about today is compassion. You've probably heard a bit about compassion this week, maybe? Yeah, it's hard to spend a week at a Buddhist Abbey and not hear about compassion, which is good. That makes me very happy. I want to talk about compassion in the way that we think about it in compassion-focused therapy, which is the model of psychotherapy, and more broadly, I think, kind of a way of looking at the human condition that I really subscribe to. It was developed by a dear friend and colleague of mine named Paul Gilbert, who's in the UK at the University of Derby. And it's based in a lot of different bodies of science. So evolution science and affective neuroscience, which is just a fancy way of saying the understanding of the neuroscience of how emotions play out in us. Our understanding of how relationships work and how that interacts with how we understand ourselves and the world, and even how our brains develop and how our genes unfold in us. And what you might call contextual behavioral science, which is an understanding of how we operate in and are influenced by the environments we're in and the context we're in. And the goal of learning to work with those contingencies and contexts in ways that maximize happy, healthy lives. Right? And all that kind of comes together. And when we talk about compassion in compassion-focused therapy, sometimes you'll hear people talk about 3 flows of compassion, which really kind of anchor to 3 different processes. Historically, and almost certainly in the Buddhist context you've been in, you probably have been hearing mostly about the flow from myself to other people, or from you to others, right? And I think historically when we say compassion, that's what we mean, right? We see others suffering, we want to help them, and so we take some action to help them, or at least cultivate the deep wish to help them if they're maybe across the world and we can't actually help them. We can still work with our own minds to try and cultivate this motivation. But recently, particularly in the fields of psychology, and although Buddhist teachers have alluded to this for hundreds, probably thousands of years too, although the emphasis has really been on having compassion for others, you know, you will sometimes hear the Buddha or other Buddhist teachers make reference to directing that same compassion to ourselves. Not because there's something special about us, but because ultimately what we really want to cultivate is what we might call universal compassion, right? Compassion for all beings. And if we're going to do that, there needs to be this recognition that, you know, we're part of all beings, right? I'm a being in the sphere of all beings. And so another flow of compassion that we might talk about, some people use the term self-compassion, but it's like compassion you direct toward yourself when you notice yourself struggling or suffering. And the third flow of compassion is about our ability to receive compassion and kindness from others, particularly when we're struggling or when we're suffering. Now, I have to say, as a psychologist, initially, I came to compassion work through the vehicle of Buddhist practice. What had happened is I'd engaged in Buddhist practice quite intensively for 3 or 4 years. Did a lot of meditating, a lot of retreats, a lot of practices. And after about 3 or 4 years, I got to a point in my career as a psychologist where I recognized that I don't even feel like I can ethically continue to treat clients without bringing some of this compassion stuff I'm learning about in Buddhism into the therapy room. Because when I reflected on the last 3 years, that was the stuff that had really been transformative for me. That had been the stuff that had really changed my life. And my historical struggle is with anger and irritability. That's kind of the emotion that I've struggled with in my life. And that, in terms of helping me work with that, the compassion practices I learned from Buddhism were really helpful. And so for me, compassion at that point had really been about compassion for others. And it was really only when I entered into the realm of psychology that I learned about these other flows, the self-compassion and then the ability to receive compassion from others. And you might ask, well, why do we need to even really work with those? I mean, isn't compassion for others enough? Right? If we do that, won't the rest of it take care of itself? I guess maybe. But I guess the point I'd really like to make around this is that if we're really going to have kind of a deep compassion for other beings, there are conditions that make that more likely and more possible and more powerful, and there are conditions that get in the way of that. And what I would suggest is the ability to direct compassion to ourselves when we're suffering, and to receive it from others who care about us when we're having a hard time, can help us create the conditions in ourselves so that we can be available to others when they need us. That will actually erode our tendency to be very self-obsessed or self-focused or very me, which is kind of the stuff that gets in the way of our ability to be compassionate toward others. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So, in compassion-focused therapy, or CFT, we kind of loosely group emotions into 3 different types. And this is a kind of a functional grouping. So there's nothing about it that's inconsistent with neuroscience research, but it's a dramatically oversimplified model. We're not saying this is exactly how it works in the brain. It's a way of talking about it that people can really connect with and relate to their own experience that is generally consistent with how things work in the brain. Does that make sense? And because we find our roots in evolution science, those three groups of emotions, three types of emotions, are really defined by their presumed evolutionary function. Right? So there are three types of emotions we talk about. One of them we call threat emotions. And we call it, we talk about emotion regulation systems, we'd say the threat system. So when you think of emotions that show up that allow you to, or help you to identify things that threaten you and respond to them, what are some emotions that come to mind for you? Fear, yeah, that's a biggie. Anger, yeah. Anxiety, nervousness, all those sort of different versions of how fear and anxiety can show up in us. Anger. And so you've got the biggies. The one last one to kind of toss in there is disgust, a kind of response, right? The idea is that kind of helps protect us from exposure to things that could poison us or make us sick, right? So we've got these threat emotions. And then we've got what we might call drive emotions, right? If you're going to succeed in living and staying alive and passing along your genes through the flow of life, there's sort of things you have to do, right? You have to acquire food and safe place to live. It helps to be able to navigate through the social world, right? If you're concerned about passing your genes forward in the flow of life, you've got to attract mates and be motivated to engage in mating activity. Right? So these are the things that our ancestors and that we have to do if we're going to keep our genes alive in the flow of life. And so there are emotions that like activate us in this way to pursue a goal and then to reward us or to help us experience a feeling of reward when we are reinforced for achieving that goal. Does that make sense? When the goal is achieved. So you could talk about ambition or lust as drive sort of emotions. We don't have as many good words, good names for those sorts of emotions. But pretty much anytime you're in that mode and you have that experience, I want that. Right? That's drive system stuff. And we all have that experience, right? Whether, as the, I've been a bad guitar player for 30 years, so my example is the new guitar player on eBay, a new guitar on eBay. It's like, right? Or that person that walks by that makes you go, mm-hmm. Yeah. right. Whatever it is, attraction. But anytime you're like, ooh, I want that, right? That feeling of excitement and that kind of purpose. And then probably, hopefully, you'll all have this experience of having achieved a goal, having, gotten a promotion or done a really good job on an exam or whatever, made it through a sadhana, getting all the words right. Right? There's a part of it. Am I right? There's a part of you that goes, yeah. I totally didn't just fumble through. I didn't do that. I got it, right? It's nice. It feels really good. And so there are emotions that are like that. And then there's a third group of emotions. One of the things we do in compassion-focused therapy is to distinguish between different types of positive emotions. Historically, emotion researchers have done a pretty good job, I think, of distinguishing between different sorts of I hate the term negative emotions, but the threat emotions, the emotions we prefer not to feel most of the time. We've studied them a lot. But a lot of the time, it seems like a lot of the positive emotions are just kind of thrown in together, like this is when you feel good. Well, it seems like we've got different sorts of positive emotions, and some of those are very activating. The drive emotions tend to feel pretty good, right? But they're good in a very activating, go, active way. The third emotion regulation system, or the third type of emotion we talk about in compassion-focused therapy, involves positive emotions that we might say are a little more low-key, right? So feeling peaceful, feeling content, feeling calm, serene, these sorts of feelings. And I would say that the number one in that, and we actually call it the soothing or safeness system when we talk about that group of emotions. The anchor point for me for those emotions is feeling safe. Right? Feeling safe. And in human beings, feeling safe, or as we say in CFT, those feelings of safeness, really are anchored through what we might call affiliation, through connection with other people. So if developmentally things have gone the way they should, we will tend to feel safe in the presence of people that we know accept us, support us, like us, just as we are. And if you want to identify times you felt that way, just try to remember a time when you were just like, and your body's relaxed and you're calm and you're not defending yourself from a threat. There's nothing you feel like you have to do. You're able just to be able to be there. It's usually those moments where you're like, this is all right. I wish it could be like this all the time. You know what I'm talking about? Have you had feelings like that? A lot of times, have you noticed that happens when you're around people who care about you? Right? When you're with kind of your people. Which in some ways is kind of tricky to say my people, because when I say my people, what does that mean? It means there are people that don't fit in that category. And one of the really tricky things about having a human life and a human brain is that even some of the chemical processes that help us feel connected and safe with people that we feel close to can heighten mistrust for if there's an outgroup for other people. And particularly in men, there's a chemical called oxytocin. And you may have heard about this, right? It tends to produce feelings of affiliation, but predominantly it produces feelings of affiliation for people that we see as our people, my group, like me. And particularly in men, that same chemical, if you look at how you feel towards people who are perceived as in an out-group, as other, different, you see increases in distrust, things like this. So very tricky. So what's the answer to that? Well, I think the answer to that is we have to take we and expand it to include everybody. Which is one of the things I love so much about Buddhism. That's what Buddhism does, right? Not just even to all people, all beings. Right? May I endure to free all beings from their suffering. Right? So, the experiences of threat and experiences of drive are tricky in that when they show up in our minds, they tend to organize how we think and pay attention and relate to one another in very particular ways. And so if you're feeling angry or anxious or even like very driven, if you've got a goal and you really, I want this, I'm going to work hard to get this. And this is one of the things that can be tricky about spiritual practice even. Right? I noticed, I don't know that I ever fell into this, although maybe a little bit. But I did notice even in my Buddhist practice that some people almost pursued it like it was a competition. Like, I'm going to be the most mindful. Right? I'm gonna be the best at, learning the sadhana, or, I'm gonna have the best answer when the teacher asks a question, or, it's very easy to get caught into that. And of course, we need a little bit of motivation, right? We want some of that. We want inspiration. We want that drive system moving. But the tricky part comes when our experiences of threat or our experiences of the kind of drive emotions are too acute or too powerful. What happens in both of those cases, threat emotions and drive emotions, have this effect of narrowing the spectrum or the scope of our attention and our thinking and reasoning and things like this. And I'm sure you will have had such experiences. Have you ever had a situation where you got in an argument or someone said something that was hurtful to you, and you had another task that you wanted to do? Maybe you had had an exam that you needed to study for or a project you needed to work on, but you just couldn't do it. Your mind kept going back to whatever that argument was and the thread, and maybe it played over in your mind again and again in terms of imagery, or you ruminated on it, you thought about it over and over and over and couldn't stop. Has everyone had those experiences? Right. Now, if you think about it, from an evolutionary context, it makes perfect sense that threat emotions would operate that way, right? Because if there's a real physical threat there, you want to be kind of single-mindedly focused on it. Right? You want to do that because, if you're distracted, well, you just got eaten. Right? On the other hand, what has happened is that the way our emotions work has not changed. That sort of evolutionary process happens relatively slowly as compared to the social evolution of human beings, which has been like that. Right? And particularly young people. You, at your age, live in an entirely different world than I did when I was your age, say 20, 25 years ago. An entirely different world. Most of you, I would bet, carry around computers in your pocket that are more powerful than the best computer we had in the 1980s, for example, when I was going to high school. Right? Think about this. You can, on an average smartphone, you can access pretty much the sum of human knowledge in an instant. Right? You can, in terms of convenience, there's this like unparalleled ability. You can communicate with anyone in the world for free in real time, looking at them on your phone. Right? It's amazing. But there's a whole different way of existing in the world. And it happened like that. In the meantime, our emotion regulation systems are still preparing us to fight off tigers. So it's very tricky. And what happens with that focus, and that focus can happen toward a threat, or the focus can happen. Goals work the same way. If you've ever had a goal, have you ever had that situation where you wanted something so bad that it was all you could think about? Maybe it was the first time you fell in love or whatever it was, buying your first home, or you're approaching graduation, you're approaching the kind of culmination of this dream, and right? Well, that focus is very tricky. I am convinced, actually, that a lot of the really terrible things that happen in the world aren't as a result of people deciding to harm others. Right? I think there are people on the planet, I think, who have developed in such a way that they actually seek to harm other people. But I think that those people, there aren't really very many of them. I think much more frequently is the case where you get someone who just latches onto their own goal, and they're so kind of blind in pursuing that goal, they're so narrowed in on that, that the suffering of other people just doesn't show up on the radar. Does that make sense? They're not even aware of it, and if they do, they're very fleetingly so, because they're completely focused. So I think that's very tricky. I think if we live in a world defined by threat and defined by just pursuit of our own goals, it's very hard for us to have compassion for others, particularly, because it's the focus. They're not showing up in our internal world. They're not there. And when we talk about compassion, and pretty much every accepted definition of compassion has two components: sensitivity to suffering and the motivation to alleviate it and prevent it. Right? So the first part's the sensitivity. It has to show up on the radar. We have to notice it before we can be moved by it, and then hopefully be motivated to help alleviate it. And so the reason, I know I told you I'd talk about these three flows of compassion, and then I started talking about emotion regulation systems, right? But the reason I'm doing that is we tend to feel safe through affiliation, and where threat focuses and narrows our awareness, right? And we basically just think about, how do I deal with this threat? And drive, when we're really caught up with a goal, narrows and focuses our awareness and our thinking. So we're really just thinking about, how do I get that? right? What safeness emotions, when we feel safe, calm, peaceful, connected, that has the opposite effect on us. And in those cases, and there's large amounts of research from different parts of psychology that show this again and again and again. When people feel safe, the spectrum of their awareness opens up. We tend to become reflective, so we can think big. Instead of just focusing on how do I get that, or how do I defend myself from whatever that perceived threat is, we can think broadly. We can do things like perspective taking. Right? When I'm chasing my goal, or I'm defending against my threat, I'm locked into my perception. Me, what's good for me? What do I want? How do I defend me? But when that's not going on, when I feel safe, then it's much easier for me to ask questions like, I wonder what Bella's feeling right now. I wonder what she's thinking. I wonder how would it make sense? Sir, your name? Tanner. How would it make sense that Tanner would behave in the way that he's doing? So instead of reacting actually to what Tanner might be doing, I can actually ask questions about how whatever he's doing actually might make a whole lot of sense given his context and his life and what he's learned and things like this. So perspective taking. It's a very important skill. And it's almost impossible to do that unless we feel safe. Right? We tend to be more reflective. One of the things, if you notice, when you're at the Abbey, this is kind of an idealized environment for being reflective, connecting with what's important in you, and then cultivating that. Why? Because as much as possible, it's a relatively threat-free environment, right? And you've got generally your basic stuff is supported. You've got a community of people working together to provide for food. You've got comfortable shelter. You've got basic needs taken care of, right? There are goals, but they're held lightly. They're held gently, and they're big goals, right? There's no, have you seen any nuns like feverishly working to accomplish something since you've been here? No. That doesn't happen. And the reason it doesn't happen is that there's this, at least intuitive sense, that that's not a way to enlightenment. That's not the way to broaden the mind, right? To do that, we need environments that are defined by affiliation and connection and safeness and peace and quiet. And in those environments, things open up for us. And we can think broadly. We can ask big questions like, what really matters to me? What's really important to me? What do I want to give to the world? When I interact with other human beings, what experience do I want them to have? Right? It's very hard to ask those questions if you're feeling threatened, if you're madly chasing after a goal. And I think that's one of the reasons in this country particularly we have so many problems, because there's almost this cultural ethic that we should be madly chasing after goals. Doesn't it almost feel like that? Like you should do this, you should do that, you should have this, you should have that. Right? You should buy this, or you should have this status, or you have this sort of job, or things like this. And there, again, this is not me, I'm not making this stuff up. There's a growing body of research that says, you know, if we really want to be happy and healthy, we need more quiet walks in the woods. We need more time where we do not much, so we can reflect. We need to move our bodies in different ways. We need to think and use our minds in different ways, not in feverishly driven ways, but in calm, centered, safe ways. This is kind of the stuff of happiness. And so if we're going to, this is why I want to talk about those three flows of compassion. Because if we're going to really prepare ourselves to have deep, enriching, meaningful spiritual lives, to be able to take the perspectives of others and look deeply to understand the causes and conditions that produce and maintain suffering, so that maybe we've got a chance of changing some of those causes and conditions. If we're going to be able to be reflective and to think deeply about what kind of life we want to have and, you know, what we really want to do in the world and what we want to give back, we've got to start by helping ourselves feel safe and to get that kind of safeness system going, because that opens things up for us. And how do we typically do this as humans? How did we evolve to do this? Through affiliation, through connections with others. And maybe there's a way to form those connections for ourselves. Now, sometimes actually you will hear people say, if you don't love yourself, you can't love anybody else. Has anyone heard that? And sometimes I hear it because I travel in compassion circles. I hear people say, if you don't have compassion for yourself, you can't have compassion for anybody else. I think that's a load of hokum. And I do, I really do. And the reason I think that's a load of hokum is I think these are actually, in some ways, fundamentally different processes. And I hang out with lots of psychologists. I hang out with lots of really big-hearted people, social workers and therapists and you know, just people that have devoted their lives to helping people with suffering. Even a few Buddhists are like this, I have found. And what I notice in a lot of these folks actually completely violates that rule that you can't love other people if you don't love yourself first. I know a lot of people who have very deep compassion for others, who in many cases have committed their lives to helping others, but whose efforts to do so are hampered by feelings of shame and self-loathing and self-criticism. These same people who have so much kindness and so much compassion and so much love for other people can in many cases seem to have almost none of that for themselves. Right? And maybe you can identify with that, and maybe you can't. When I'm talking about this sometimes, Paul Gilbert in CFT developed this. It's not really a metaphor, more kind of a story of, you know, this idea of you could have two teachers. So I want you to imagine for a moment that you've got a child that you care a lot about. Maybe it's your child, or maybe it's a cousin or a sibling or a kid down the street, but it's a child that you really love, right? And you're invested in their happiness. You want them to have a happy life. So I want you to imagine that this child is learning an inherently difficult task. Maybe they're learning to play a musical instrument or learning to play tennis. Do we have any tennis players in here? Any of you play tennis? Tennis is really hard. Like, it really is. You watch people who do it, they make it look easy. It's really hard. It's very, or maybe learning a language, right? Learning a language is very difficult as well. So I want you to imagine that this child has one of two different teachers. And I'm going to set this up, and then I'll ask you a couple stupid questions, maybe one not so stupid one. So I want you to imagine, on one hand, that this child has a really kind of harsh, driven, critical teacher. Right? And this teacher just wants to keep the child working. Right? So we can even imagine how this teacher might interact with the child. We can imagine what he or she might say. You know, no, 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 wrong again. No, what's wrong with you? No, not like that, stupid, like this. How many times do I have to tell you? I don't even know why I waste my time on you. What is, no, no, no. Right? You maybe even noticed, you know, I'm having, I'm just giving an example, but you notice when I was saying no over and over, maybe an emotional recoiling. Right? That's criticism. The harshness is powerful. So that's the critical teacher, the shaming teacher. So on the other hand, I want you to imagine, what if this child were to have a kind, compassionate teacher? This is a compassionate teacher who recognizes that this is actually a difficult task, that anyone who starts it, who doesn't know how to do it, is going to struggle, right? And that really, you know, the teacher is also wise. The teacher has the understanding that all that I really need to do is to keep the kid struggling with it, to keep them trying, because that's how you get better, right? We just need to keep them going. And so the teacher's kind, wants the kid to do better, wisely understands this, and is sort of committed to the child's growth. So we can imagine how this compassionate teacher might interact with the child in a way that's very different than the critical teacher. We could imagine the compassionate teacher, what they might say. There you go. There you go. Good, good. Not quite like that. Like that. Yeah, that's it. That's it. This is really hard, but you're trying, and I'm so proud of you. Just keep going. You're doing great. That's it. There you go. Right? Same task, two different teachers. So now for a couple stupid questions. So, this is your kid or a child that you really love. Which teacher would you rather that child have? One or two? Okay, we're all agreed. We got lots of twos going up. That's good. Okay, so let's say, just hypothetically speaking, that actually you didn't care that much about this child. I mean, except insofar as you care about all children. Right? That there was no special significance of this child to you. It wasn't your child or your niece or your nephew. It wasn't anyone that you felt any particular attachment to. But you were invested in the child learning the task. You wanted them to get better. Right? You wanted them to learn whatever this challenging task was. Which teacher would you rather that child have? One or two? Two. Good. Okay. So we've all agreed that whether the motivation is one of caring for the child or whether the motivation is one of wanting the child to succeed, that second teacher would probably be better. Right? So let me ask you a third question. When you observe yourself struggling, which teacher does the voice in your head sound most like? Yeah, I got some ones. Yeah. So I think I'm just going to leave that right there. Right? I don't think, do you need any commentary about that, right? So I was like, So the take-home message that I'm going to try and leave you with today is that if you really want to cultivate compassion for all beings, and you really want to be able to maintain a connection in your life to the big questions. I presume that most of you will not be entering the Abbey in residence. I suspect that most of you will be returning to your lives filled with frustrations and things don't go the way you like, and filled with goals and dreams and things you want to do or acquire or achieve. How do we do that? How do we plug back in to the world outside of the monastic life in a way that allows us to actually continue asking the big questions and continue our concern, not getting caught up with all the little stuff, but continue our connection with these questions of what kind of person do I want to be? What are my values? What really matters to me? Knowing that every interaction I have with another human being, I'm impacting them in some way, and asking, how do I want to impact the humans in my life? What impact do I want to have on the people I kind of cross paths with? If we're going to ask those questions, we've got to find a way to help ourselves feel safe, to keep that open. The other thing that happens, by the way, and there's a lot of research that shows this, we naturally become pro-social. When we feel safe and comfortable, we will naturally tend to help one another. It's in there. Right? Rumi, one of my favorite, I think it was Rumi. I don't want to misquote Rumi on video, right? I think it was Rumi who said something. I'm going to get the quote wrong, but because, but I'll get the gist of it. The quote, and I love it, was something like, we don't have to seek for love. We only have to seek and uproot the obstacles in our hearts that stand in the way of love. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And that's, I got the first part of the quote and I massacred the last bit, but that's it. The idea is that when we open the way, when we get rid of the obstacles, the stuff that gets in the way, our hearts will naturally open. Right? And until we do that, it makes it almost impossible. We can't will ourselves to be open when we're experiencing all this threat. right? That actually fits very nicely with another of my favorite quotes. And this is not the quote either. I modify this to suit my own purposes. But it's by another Buddhist teacher, Pema Chodron, who I heard once on one of her audio teachings say something like, since only death is certain and the time of death is uncertain, what do I do? What's the most important thing? The what do I do is my bit. But the idea is, with this awareness that, all I know really is that I am here now. And maybe I've got many, many more years on this planet, right? And maybe some of you will be lifelong friends. Maybe we'll have a connection, that spans decades. But I suspect at least some of you, maybe most or all of you, when I get in that car to drive away from the Abbey, that may be the last point of connection that we ever have, right? And maybe that's because our lives take different paths. Maybe that's because there are billions and billions of people on the planet. Maybe it's because I get in a car wreck on the way back to Spokane and my candle is snuffed out. Now, don't look at me all dourly. That's not going to happen, I hope. But the point is it could, right? The point is we don't know how much time we've got. And even if we're here a long time, we don't know how much time we have together. And that, to me, that's a spiritual practice. That's like a daily meditation for me. Since only death is certain and the time of death is uncertain, what's the most important thing? And that's one of the wonderful things about Buddhism, by the way. Those of you who have studied Buddhism at all will recognize, oh, what's that? That's impermanence. We talk about that all the time. One of the things that the Buddhists have done better than anybody else, in my view, including psychologists, is to recognize that working with the mind and changing the way we are in a meaningful, enduring way is a lot of work. And so if you're really going to commit yourself to Buddhist practice, you're going to learn what they call preliminary practices. You're going to learn stuff that is designed to prepare your mind for the deep spiritual practices that lie ahead, so that you'll stay with it when it gets hard, so that you'll keep going in the face of the difficulty. And they talk about the 4 thoughts that change the mind. Right? One of those is impermanence. Right? We have this, another one's a sacred human life. Right? We have this real gift of having a human life that gives us this ability to work with our minds. But we don't know how long we've got it for. We don't know. So do we have time? I ask myself this question, do I have so much time in my life that I'm willing to give away some of those moments to resentment or hatred or jealousy or da-da-da-da-da? Does that make sense? I mean, I can. It's my life. I can choose to spend my time in that way. But to me, it feels like I'm just tossing away moments of my life to death. It's like, here you go. Have an hour. I want that hour. I want that hour, and I want to be happy in that hour, and I want to use that hour to have a meaningful connection with somebody, or to do something that, helps make somebody happy, or at least helps me makes me happy, which certainly resentment and jealousy and anger and hatred don't. Right? And so, to come back around, I think one of the things we can really do to help set ourselves up for a really deep spiritual life and a happy life and a life where we can have compassion for others and really show up with our full selves for them is to learn to also help ourselves when we're struggling, and maybe more importantly, to allow others to be able to help us too. And I would be willing to bet that there are at least a person or two in this room that actually is pretty good at showing up for other people when they need help. But because of your histories and because of lots of other things, I would bet that at least for some of you, it might be really, really hard actually to accept kindness or love or caring. Like to really understand and believe that another person really holds you in their heart very deeply and really values you and really loves you and really cares about you. You know, I think a lot of us, for lots of reasons, can develop shame. And this shows up in a lot of different ways. It shows up in a sense of just being bad, or this sense that there's something wrong with me. Deep down, there's something wrong with me. And I can tell you as a psychologist, if we were to come up with a catalog of the most painful thoughts a human being can have, which I will never do because that sounds like a miserable job. But if I was devoted to doing that, I am pretty sure there's something wrong with me would be in the top 10, both in terms of the most painful and the most common. And if we have this sense of badness that we could have gotten in any number of ways, we don't have the time to talk about all the ways we can acquire that sort of way of relating to the self. But it can show up in lots of tricky ways. It can show up by us holding back in close relationships out of fear that if the other person really got to know us, they wouldn't want us. They'd reject us. They really saw us, they wouldn't like what they saw because we feel like we don't like what we see. That's another trick of that perception I talked about before. One of the problems with having like unlimited access to our own experience and our feelings and all these emotions and the struggle and the insecurity and the anger and the fear and the lust and the thoughts that we have that we shouldn't have. We have unlimited access to that stuff, and yet when we look out at other people, we don't see that at all. So have you ever had that experience of you're experiencing all this inner turmoil and you look around the room and it's like, they all seem to be fine. You have, haven't you? What does that set you up to experience in terms of all that stuff you're feeling? The fear, the insecurity, the anger. You're feeling it all on your side, but they all seem to be fine. You don't see any of that in them. So it's easy to think that that stuff is something that's wrong with me. And I think that can be compounded by media that gives us these pictures of what are supposed to look like. These celebrities like, you know, life is great all the time. That's hokum too. You know, life is not great all the time. To have a human life involves lots of pain. You know, we're going to lose people we love. We're going to get sick. We're going to die. We're going to strive, sometimes urgently, for goals that we desperately want, and we're going to fail. We won't achieve them. Right? It's just the way it is. That's the way it is for everybody. And a lot of people are born into situations that are much worse than that. You know, if you look around the world, you know, there are places where people's primary goal for the day is, can I get enough water to survive? And if I do, will it poison me? Right? But even if you're like me, you know, a privileged white guy, straight white guy in the middle of a culture designed to work really well for straight white guys, you still face all these sources of pain and suffering and difficulty. That's one of the reasons privileged white guys have a hard time admitting that they're privileged white guys. Because when they hear the word privilege, they think that means it's easy for me. And I can tell you, my experience of life is not that it's easy for me. But, or I should say, and I don't even see the thousands of obstacles that exist for women or people of color or gays and lesbians and bisexual and transgender folk or people from other parts of the world or other cultures. Obstacles that never even enter my awareness because I've never had to face them. That's what the privilege is. Right? It's not a gift that someone gives me that makes it an easy life. It's all the stuff I don't have to deal with, that I'm unaware of, because I don't have to deal with it. So, one of the things that can happen when you start really cultivating compassion for others, these flows, they're separate processes in some ways, but I think they can deepen one another. One of the things that can happen when we really begin to have compassion for others and we really begin to look deeply into their experience is that we recognize that their experience can look a lot like our experience. We recognize that actually these feelings about me that I feel so acutely and so painfully and they're so difficult, they're not something that's bad about me. Because Tanner sometimes is afraid too. Bella sometimes is angry. What's your name, Miss? Riley. Sometimes is disappointed with herself or does something that doesn't fit with her values. Well, maybe not Riley, but the rest of us. So the compassion gives us a window into the experiences of other people, because what I find is that when someone understands that I'm actually deeply invested in their happiness, that I actually really care about how they are and whether or not they have a happy life, I find that I don't have to work very hard to hear their stories. I don't have to coerce them to share. In fact, so many of us, have you ever had that experience of coming across someone and you just knew, whatever it was they did, cued you, that this is someone who wants to help me. This is someone who actually genuinely cares about me. Your story almost flows out of you, doesn't it? You want to share it. We want to share our stories, but only when we know that our stories are going to be valued and held. You know, and I think the side benefit for us, and the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama says this, you know, if you want to be selfish, be wisely selfish, be compassionate. Right? If we really want to help ourselves, help others. Because what happens is when we manifest that compassion and people start telling us our stories and we start seeing their pain and their suffering, it helps us understand that our pain and suffering isn't something that's wrong with us. It's this normal part of human life that we all share. And now suddenly all that stuff that I feel that's so difficult for me, instead of being something that sets me apart from you and makes me feel separate and different, it's something that makes me feel close. You know, because if I was to tell you, I feel sad, you could probably relate to some part of that, couldn't you? Maybe you wouldn't know exactly what it's like for me to feel sad, but you'd know what it's like for you. And you'd feel some sympathy for me, maybe. Oh, I know that place. That's hard. And maybe there'd be a connection between us that would help both of us feel a little safer, a little more open. So one of the things I'd like to encourage you to do as you go through your life, and to give yourself permission to do, is to challenge yourself to find ways to help yourself feel safe and comfortable. And to challenge yourself to try to accept love and kindness from others, to allow people to care about you. And for some of you that won't be easy, depending on our early histories with caregivers and relationships, and then with relationships with others, friends and partners as we go older. If we've been hurt interpersonally or traumatized, it can be really difficult, and it can be hard for us, and it can be hard for the people we're trying to form relationships to, because many of us will have this experience of, okay, up here in their fancy thinking new brain, I want to have a relationship, right? I want to have a relationship. I want to do this. And what happens is, it's going well, it's going out, and as soon as you get to the point where you've wanted to be and it feels really close, what happens? You freak out, right? Because that old emotional brain has learned that actually closeness can be dangerous. It means being vulnerable. It means opening to someone who can then hurt you. And I guess my challenge to you is, in those instances, we have to be selective. But in those instances, when you're with someone that you have figured out actually really does care about you and really does
want the best for you and really does want to be happy for you and help you, if you could stay even in the face of that difficulty, to recognize, rather than freaking out and bolting or shifting very quickly into something that distracts from the intimacy. And there are lots of ways we can do that. We can do that with our sexuality, actually. It's like people who really struggle with emotional intimacy, a lot of times will rush into sexual intimacy because it's like, it's a little more containable. Doesn't feel so amorphous, doesn't feel so difficult. But what if we actually just let ourselves take some breaths, slow things down and go, wow, it's really hard to allow myself to feel loved. This is really uncomfortable and I want it, but it's terrifying. What if I stay? What if I see what happens? You know? So rather than me, I'm a university professor, so I can almost literally talk indefinitely. I can just talk. But I've been talking quite a lot, so maybe it would be a good time to have some questions. If anyone has any questions or thoughts, things that came up for you, things that resonated, things that you disagreed with, anything like this. Stuff that didn't fit with your experience, and what do you think? One thing Buddhist teachers say that I love is, don't believe anything I say. Try it out. See if it matches your own experience. And while I don't try to promote myself as any kind of a Buddhist teacher, I would say the same thing. Don't believe anything I say unless it matches your own experience. Yes?
Okay, so you said there was like 3 different kinds of emotion, and it was threat and like goal.
Yeah, drive, goal-driven, and
yeah, and then
safeness. Yeah.
kinds of stuff. Where would like sadness and stuff?
I'm so glad you asked that. And I am, because that's the one that doesn't fit very well. These are kind of, again, they're functional groupings meant to help people kind of relate to their experience in ways that make sense. And that was so smart to catch that, because a lot of times people don't catch that for a while. Sadness doesn't fit very well, does it? It's not activating and narrowing the way threat emotions are. It's certainly not rah-rah drivey. And it doesn't fit really easily in the safeness system, although it does have some social functions. I mean, one of the things that happens is when we feel sad, it tends to invite nurturing. When you see someone who's sad, what do you want to do? Right? We want to naturally comfort them. So when I talk about sadness, my answer to that is that sadness doesn't actually fit very well into that 3-circle model. And so when I think of sadness, and we could also talk about other emotions like this if we wanted to. But I think of sadness in terms of patterns of activation in each of those circles. So for example, I think sadness is sort of moderate threat, because sadness, usually some threat, but it's more the threat of loss than of an active threat that's endangering me right now. Sadness is more about loss, but that can feel kind of threatening. If the threat gets too high, it's going to turn into anxiety or anger. Right? But sadness, I think, is low, moderate threat. Sadness, if we look at that drive, that motivation circle, I think that's very low drive. Right? Sadness is not really about escalating up toward doing anything. It's really about kind of slowing down and shrinking in some ways. And then I think sadness actually is kind of moderate safeness as well. Because again, if you're feeling threatened, you're not going to be sitting there and sad. And if you look at sadness, I don't know about you, but when I'm experiencing sadness, there's a lot of reflectiveness that goes along with that. So a lot of the calm, it's not necessarily content, although for me sometimes it almost is. Have you ever had that experience of like almost enjoying sinking into a sadness? Yeah, and just, and I think it's okay sometimes to notice, I feel really sad right now. Maybe I'll feel sad for a little while. Now the key is you don't want to live there, right? And some people do, I think. Some people allow themselves to dip down and then they never, get back out of bed and make efforts to pull it back out. So I think but sadness in some doses, I think they can all be really useful. I want to say in terms of those 3 systems, by the way, in CFT, the goal isn't to be 100% safe all the time. The goal is to have a fluid, flexible emotional response that's a match to whatever you need to do, right? So if there's a goal, there's something I need to do, I feel motivated and active to do that. So I want to help clients. I want to do research. I want to teach my students, right? I want to find a way to get here on time in the morning, even given the construction, right? So the idea is that my emotions, I can respond with whatever's needed, right? And the problem is, I think we live in a culture that hyperactivates our threat response. So we feel a lot more threatened than is really called for by most of the situations that we get into, which can be really crippling in terms of our ability to work flexibly with whatever's showing up. So, yeah, but I would see sadness as like really low drive and kind of low moderate threat and safeness, and others might argue with that, but you've got loss, kind of a deactivation of go, 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 and then a reflectiveness and an ability to kind of look, oh gosh, what does this mean to me that I just lost this person I care about or whatever happened, and to reflect on that. So does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I have a little question. Do you have any tips on how to find compassion for people that you want to have compassion for, but they're doing wrong by you, know that,
Yeah, that's tricky, right? So there are people you want to have compassion for, but they're pushing your buttons, and they're actually doing stuff that's hurtful. They're actually, being harmful or being, passive aggressive or doing things that are really getting under your skin. So I think there are a variety of ways to do that. I think the first thing that you need to do is, or that I would do, that's helpful for me. I hate to say, this is what you need to do. Right, that's such a terrible thing to say. But the first thing that I try to do in the face of that is to first work to help me feel safe. To slow down my breath and to not be in the face of whatever they're presenting me with that I'm feeling is threatened. Because if I'm right there, then I'm going to be focused on that jerk, what they're doing to me, versus whatever compassionate response I want to have. So I want to find a way to help me feel a little safer, slow down my breath, connect with other people that care about me, whatever. And then I would want to bring up of an awareness of that person from their side. One of the weird things about the world is almost everybody thinks that they're the good guy. You know what I'm saying? I mean, we're having this huge gun debate. Right now in this country, the Democrats are having a sit-in the floor of the House of Congress. I think it's continuing today. It was all day yesterday. They're having a sit-in. They're refusing to leave. They're refusing to do business until there's a vote on gun regulations. Right? They want to work to keep the guns out of people that we know or have some data that indicates they're likely to be dangerous. Now, the details of that are debatable. But there's this big debate. And on each side, you've got these two sides. And on one side, you've got people who are absolutely committed to getting rid of assault rifle style weapons, right? Guns that allow people to kill lots of people or lots of things in very short periods of time. And so these people are very committed. And if you ask them, they will tell you, we're the good guys, right? Well, I grew up in rural Oklahoma. And social media is challenging for me these days because I'm one of these folks. I mean, for me, if you took away all the guns, I'd be cool with that. I would be. Someone's going to watch this on YouTube. I knew it. He wants to take away my guns. No, sir, I don't want to take away your guns. But
Oklahoma as well.
Good. But if you were to give them up voluntarily, I would be much happier. So we have these folks there. But on the other side, you've got these people who, for lots of reasons, and probably, for lots of reasons, actually are very committed to the idea of having guns and all of these diversity of guns and being able to get them and access them and not having them regulated in any sort of way. And guess what? Those folks think they're the good guys too. They think they're fighting, and in some senses, I guess they are, for freedoms. Right? And I can't talk about this in an unbiased way because I have a very clear bias toward the kind of, let's not all have an arsenal of weaponry. So I'm biased, so I can't give fair treatment to the other perspective on that. But I know a lot of really good, really rational, really intelligent people who are absolutely invested in protecting what they would call gun rights, and who experience themselves as very, being the good guys, being patriotic, being very invested in protecting people and things like this. And so I think in most cases, we all kind of think we're the good guys. And so if I'm in that situation, the first thing I want to do is kind of work with my own stuff. Then I want to remind myself that this other person that's giving me such difficulty, that their behavior is triggering whatever in me. And actually that's a hint too. Their behavior is triggering something in me. It's not just about them. I have some responsibility for how I react too. But I can remind myself that just like me, that person only wants to be happy and not suffer. Just like me, this person has this really deep, nuanced life story. And that there is very likely a context behind the way they're acting that if I knew it would make complete sense of their behavior to me. If I knew their story, and I might even imagine how might what they're doing, how they're behaving from their side make complete sense. From my side, it's a real irritation. But from their side, how does it make sense? Is there some part of the situation that's triggering feelings of them, of not being safe, or of feeling threatened, or of things like this, right? So for example, in terms of this gun debate, the people who I have had conversations with that are really pro-gun have this sense that, hey, if we gave up our guns, we're helpless. What happens when the people with the gun come to our house? What can we do? How do we protect ourselves? Right? So if we understand that there are feelings of threat that underlie, that experience, in the same way, one of the things, if you look at the things that people do that seem nonsensical, if we look deeply into the context and the way they're making sense of their situation, very often, actually, it makes complete sense. Most of you are young enough that you probably all will know somebody who self-harms, who cuts themselves, or who self-harms in other ways. Maybe some of you have even had some experience with that. And at face value, that seems like a crazy behavior, right? Why would anyone do that? Why would anyone purposefully harm themselves? It seems like nonsense, right? Unless you look at the context in which people do this. And almost universally, when people self-harm, they're self-harming in the face of acute emotional pain. They're hurting so bad. And there's stuff that happens, and we don't fully understand exactly what happens. But some of it has to do with when you're hurting on the outside, how it focuses your attention. Some of it has to do with chemicals that are released in the body when that happens. But if you talk to someone who does that, they will tell you, when I cut, I feel better. I experience this terrible pain. And when I cut, I feel better. And so if we understand that, if we understand how it makes sense that someone would behave the way they do, we can have compassion for them, even when their behavior makes us really uncomfortable or makes us is not what we would like. And that understanding can sometimes even lead to a solution that helps change things. Because in that example, for example, of the person who self-harms, if I understand that that person is self-harming not because of something that's bad about them, but because they're overwhelmed with emotional pain and they're desperate to find something to alleviate it, then I know what my job is. My job is to help them find another way of alleviating that pain that does not require them to self-harm. Does that make sense? So I guess I would try first to calm myself. Second, to remind myself that this person only wants to be happy and to not suffer just like me, and they have this deep emotional life and experience and it runs just as deep as mine does. And then I would try to sort of understand the situation from their side and to understand how their behavior might make sense given their situation, their background, their experience. And maybe, if I'm lucky, that'll give me a way to connect with them that can help change things in a positive way. But at the very least, it might make it easier for me to tolerate what I'm experiencing from them, because rather than just there being threat, there's some understanding that supports it. Does that help?
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for the question. That was marvelous. Any other questions? Do we have time for maybe one more? Yeah? Yes, go for it.
It's past 10, but it doesn't matter.
Okay, I mean, I don't have, you folks are in charge of the schedule, so you just let me know.
Schedule can be flexible.
Oh, good, good. Yes?
So have you had some times where like, you feel really, really good and you want to share it with someone? For some reason you can't, it's like there's a wall and the emotions can't get through. That frustrates you a little bit, and then sometimes when you actually express it, it could also happen that the other person doesn't pick up. Like you can't really like transmit how you're feeling to the other person. And then it goes a little bit further because even if you can, there's still kind of like a separation. So it's almost as if you want to like take how you're feeling because you want to share it and you want to sort of like merge it with the other person, right? But obviously that's impossible. So in any of these situations, I found out that it kind of like rebounds and then I feel depressed because I can't do this. Is that, and has that ever happened to you? And if it has, then how do you?
Yeah, well, I think yes. I think for me, if I kind of reflect on my own experience for a minute, I've had a lot of exciting things happen in my life the last few years. And I've had these moments of just like real pleasure and happiness around that. And I have had that experience of like wanting to share it with somebody. But for various reasons, that was really hard because I didn't want it to. Sometimes if you see someone, for example, for whom things aren't going quite so well, you can feel like, gosh, if I share how great I'm doing, that could make them feel bad rather than good. Or maybe as you were kind of getting at, it's hard to capture it. It's hard to alleviate, or how hard to kind of get it across. What I find is that in my life, there are just a few people that works easier with than others. And so one thing I would encourage you to do is as you go through life, to try and cultivate friendships. And it can be hard to find people like that. But when you do, invest some time in it so that maybe you have a person or two that you can really be really, really honest with and that they value that. And those are hard relationships to find, but they're worth like supporting when we do find them. The other question I would have though for you, and I've had that experience of being kind of deflated when I wanted to share how I was feeling and I wasn't able to get it across, or maybe it didn't land. I did my best and the other person was like, oh yeah, yeah, that's cool, And it's like, no, you don't understand how cool it is, right? But it doesn't land. And then you say, well, and that can feel deflating because there's a part of us that really wants to share that. But if you find when it doesn't come across, and then you find your own mood kind of deflate, to maybe look deeply and ask, what's that about? Right? Why would it be that I can't really allow myself to enjoy this if I feel like the other is not getting across? Because if that's happening with me, that's something about me. Right? That's something about me, and maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's a desire to be like understood, a deep kind of desire to be understood, or a feeling of not having been understood or not having someone who's invested in me. So a lot of times the reaction we have to those situations can point to like other hurts that we might have, right? And so how might I, if I want to have those relationships, what can I do? Well, what I find is the more I work to be someone who really connects with other people and listens to their story and really values it, the better they get at doing the same to me. And the other thing I can do is what if we can develop this internal voice that says, well, maybe they don't get it, but this was still really cool. I can still be excited about this. Again, back to that example before. What's your internal voice sound like? Is it warm and nurturing, or is it harsh and critical? And that tone of voice, just that can be really powerful, right? So even a very kind thought, like everyone just wants to be happy and not suffer, loses its potency and means something very different if it's said in a harsh, critical voice. Everyone just wants to be happy and not suffer. Not very helpful, right? So even if I'm telling myself, I react in a way that I'm not entirely happy with, and even if I'm trying to like comfort myself by telling myself something like, well, you know, Russell, it makes sense that you would feel this in this situation. If it's in a contempt, it makes sense if you'd feel this in this situation. That doesn't feel very good, right? So we want to pay attention to our internal voice. I have a student who was in my compassion-focused therapy course at Eastern, who found that she had this self-critical voice that just ran off the rails. So whatever she was doing, there was this voice in her head that was saying, well, you shouldn't, da-da-da-da-da, you're no good, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And she couldn't get rid of it. And of course, when we've learned that, we really, you can't just get rid of it. But what she decided to do was to give that voice kind of a goofy tone of voice. Right? You can't do anything right. You know, give it the Donald Trump voice. I've got the best self-criticism. Everyone's talking about self-criticism. My self-criticism, but I criticize myself better than anyone on the planet. Right? So I guess I have some friends in a model of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. And one of the things they talk about is holding things lightly. And I'm wondering if we can kind of learn to do that. Then when things happen, and it's like I try to communicate what I'm feeling, and maybe it doesn't get through. If I can hold that experience lightly and say, well, yeah, it's very hard to communicate exactly what I want, and maybe I want to see what I can do to have more kind of deeper relationships in my life that makes that a little more possible. You know, I don't know if that's helpful at all, but it is tricky. And I'd look at, you know, when you have that experience of hurt that comes out of that, to try and look and go, where's the hurt? You know, what is it about this? Why is this so upsetting to me? What does it mean? What does it mean about me? And sometimes those questions can lead us to, I feel like maybe if whatever isn't recognized by others, that it isn't really real, or it isn't really worth being happy about, or whatever it is, you know, to try and kind of look deeply into that experience and then bring the same kindness to yourself that you might bring to someone else, right? You might even imagine, like, what would I say if someone else was having this experience? If someone had asked me that question, what would I do? You know, I might say, you know, it's hard to communicate, but I'm so happy that you're happy about this. And I think it's fantastic. What if you could relate that to yourself? You know? So no easy answers, but hopefully that speaks to the question. Any others? Well, thank you so much for your kind attention. This is always a great pleasure. So.